like to express my appreciation first to the Boston Uhuru Solidarity Movement, to all of you who have come out. Cannot overstate my appreciation for your attendance and participation in this meeting. I think that most of you are probably too young to understand the significance of your presence in this meeting that we are having on today. There are two things that we are contending with right now. It is a fact, I believe, that much of what you've heard and perhaps what you will hear in this meeting will be shocking to some extent, because it is not the ordinary discussion that we have. It is not the typical discussion that you will hear or participate in with an African in this country, a so-called black person who's involved in some kind of movement. It is not typical. It has been typical, however, in the past. And it was extraordinarily typical in the 1960s, when revolution was the main trend in the entire world. Everybody wants to be free. Regardless of what your local politician may say, or the head of your local civil rights movement, everybody on the planet Earth wants to be free. And in the 1960s, we saw an incredible movement of oppressed people everywhere who were struggling to get Europe and America off their necks. This is the thing that has given some people tremendous resources, even creating an industry of sorts to produce T-shirts of Che Guevara. In fact, he was one of the last that people are familiar with and aware, the great romantic who stood for freedom and liberation. But it wasn't just Che Guevara, it was peoples all over the world who wanted to be free. I think that that's one of the problems that we're contending with, is because with the defeat of that revolutionary project, and certainly the defeat of the black revolution of the 1960s, most of us have relied on subjectivism as a substitute for some kind of scientific assessment, analysis of the world that we live in, the contradictions that we are confronted with. And subjectivism may be very good when it comes to our personal relationships with people we love and what have you, but trying to assess this world that we live in, it doesn't serve us at all. Some people say that you can understand the world is just a matter of common sense. But I would remind you that common sense tells us that the world is flat. It is not flat. We need more than common sense. We need to have a scientific approach to understanding what is happening in the world. Why is the United States government engaged in perpetual warfare against all the peoples around the world? How is it that everybody on earth that would dare to define the United States or Europe is a terrorist or a terrorist organization? But the center of humanity and decency, it seems, being located here in the United States or in Europe. Most of us, I think, instinctively know that there's something wrong with that understanding. Another contradiction that we have to deal with that's related to this whole issue of subjectivism is that for a long period of time, certainly since the 1960s, it has been extraordinarily true that white people, Europeans, have easily been able to perceive yourselves and be perceived as the subjects of history, while the rest of us are simply objects of history. The conquerors write the history, define the reality. I grew up as a child learning to cry and be happy for white people because the books that I read were written in first person by white people, about white people, and about me. I learned to love and empathize with poor Tiny Tim, who was treated so badly by Mr. Scrooge. And despite the despair that Tiny Tim may have experienced, this character may have experienced, because you know that Dickens was a part of a kind of movement that happened in Europe. They were like utopian socialists. They were opposed to what was happening to children and people under capitalism. But before it was possible for Tiny Tim to be exploited in a factory in Europe, it was necessary to rape Africa and other places for resources where children never had an opportunity to see a factory to be exploited in, and the thousands and thousands and scores and hundreds of thousands and millions of people died in the process of getting that product to the point of production where Tiny Tim was located. But I couldn't cry for them. I knew nothing about them. All my reality had me thinking as the white person who wrote about Tiny Tim and wrote about me. So this is a contradiction. It isn't just a contradiction because white people wrote all the books and produced all the movies and things like that. It was a contradiction because I dare not say that I disagreed with anything that white people said, because it could and did cost lives to do that. Yeah. I couldn't say that no. I couldn't say no to whites. I had to pretend to agree even when I did not agree. And this contributed to the ability of white people to be able to define themselves for themselves, by themselves, without any intervention from anybody else. You think about how significant that is. That's like being able to judge yourself by yourself. I love myself. I think I'm grand. I sit in the movies and hold my hand. I slide my arm around my waist, and when I get fresh, I slap my face. It's this self-absorption that the entire white world has wallowed in at the expense of everybody else. Let me say just a couple of things. Most of us who are here, I am sure, are here in part because we don't like the things that's happening in the world. We don't like the perpetual war. We don't like the fact that the United States is leading a war against people in Yemen that's killing at least one child every 10 minutes. We don't like the fact that we live in a world where something like 80% of the people on earth are trying to survive off $10 or less a day. And 50% of the people on the planet Earth are trying to survive off $2.50 or less a day. And if you're in Africa, you spend most of the day just trying to earn enough for a single meal. We don't like that. We don't like what we see in this political realm with the Donald Trump. And if we were smart enough, we wouldn't have liked what we saw even with Barack Hussein Obama or Hillary Clinton or the rest of them. We don't like the fact that this whole political electoral scheme and process that puts us in this cynical position of always having to vote for the lesser of the two evils. That's a hell of a situation to be in. And I agree with you. I'm opposed to it also. I'm opposed to police murder. of African people. I'm opposed to this so-called wall that they want to create, but more than opposed to the wall, I'm opposed to the fact that half of Mexico was stolen at gunpoint, calling Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico, Colorado, you name it, Utah, all of this was stolen in the first place. So to talk about putting up a wall really begs the question, and how can you hate a wall on the southern artificially created border of the United States, but love a wall and the walls that exist in occupied Palestine that they call Israel? How hypocritical can you be? So I just want to say just a few things, because most of us, many of us, hate capitalism. I've been reading that a huge sector of the population in this country today say that they like socialism, they say. Of course, many of them are thinking of a Bernie Sanders kind of socialism, which if it were real, Sanders wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But many of us don't like capitalism. We don't like the outcome. And I want to just say a few things about it, because capitalism is foul. It's a foul social system. And we know that some of the characteristics of capitalism, that it is a system that's based on commodity production, you know? And a commodity is something that's not just something that's produced because somebody needs it. A commodity is produced for sale, for trade. Profit is the motive force of everything that is produced in a capitalist society. That includes so-called, that's why you can't have health care, because it's not profitable to cure disease. That's why hospitals are not created to cure people. Hospitals are created to make money. That's what the whole social system rests on, profit. It drives every question. It's not profitable to cure cancer. It's profitable to create conditions that create cancer, that promote cancer, that make cancer happen. This is under capitalism. It's a foul social system. When you have a system where the basis of production is to make money, is profit, then you have a problem. And some of you see it. Some of you see it every time you turn on a television and there is some advertisement for what's supposed to be some medication that can help you. And then at the end of the big pitch, what you see is people dancing in meadows and butterflies and cheerful music. And then you don't really hear the words that if you touch this stuff that we are selling now, you're subject to go blind, die, or something else will happen to you. That's capitalism that's doing that. And capitalism creates disease. Capitalism will create a disease to fit whatever product that they've created that's supposed to be a medicine. They have created things. What is the drug that they use when children in the schools? What's it called? Ritalin. Yeah. They created it. And they say, now we got to create a disease to fit it. And it's something that's plaguing children, especially African children throughout this country. That's capitalism. We know that capitalism is also based on wage labor. And when we talk about wage labor, we're talking about people under capitalism do not get paid for what you produce. You know that, right? Everybody knows that, right? You work in a table factory, you don't get paid for what you produce. If you got paid for what you produce, you get paid what the person got for selling the table. You get paid not for what you produce, you get paid for your ability to produce. Which means that if you're lucky, you get paid enough to feed, clothe, and house yourself so that you can repair yourself to come back and make some more tables the next day. This is what capitalism is about. And most of what you produce, most of your labor power is something that goes unpaid. You don't get paid. That's why workers have to struggle for 15-minute breaks, struggle to take off on holidays and things like that, because it's not for you. In fact, the theft of the value of your labor power is what the capitalist production functions on. Yeah. And that's why people complain about how capitalism robs people at the point of production. And then, of course, you know that capitalism is based on the private ownership of the means of production. So here you've got people socially, you have socialized production. All production is socialized. People participate collectively to produce everything. Even if they're not in the same factory, even if they're not in the same countries and what have you, it's socialized production for everything. So you have this profound contradiction of socialized production on the one hand, and then private ownership on the other hand, private ownership of what has been produced on the other hand. So that people who make cars and build houses can afford cars and houses to live in, but people who don't make cars and don't build houses, they got all the loot, they own it privately. Not only do they have a house, they have scores of houses and cars and everything else. Yeah. This is capitalism. And that's why many of us hate capitalism, but it's more than that. And this is the fundamental thing that's necessary for us to understand. Karl Marx, describing capitalism, was vexed by, I like that term, vexed, by this contradiction of the fact is that if there is going to be capitalist production, there had to first be an accumulation of capital, capitalist accumulation. And if there was going to be a capitalist accumulation, then there had to be capitalist production. How the hell do you get out of this vicious trap? And he said the only way that we can understand this is to presuppose that there was an accumulation of capital that was not a consequence of capitalist production, but the starting point. And he said this starting point that he referred to as the primitive accumulation of capital, first capital, he said this starting point was transforming Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. And he talked about this primitive accumulation being the war that was fought 1841 and 42 by England against China that they call the Opium War. Yeah. Because England wanted to trade opium to China for China's tea, and China said thanks but no thanks. And so this is how trade works. If you look at how Trump helps to take the covers off, they say, yeah, we're going to trade, quote unquote, and they brought the guns in and attacked China and turned China into a nation of drug addicts, junkies. This is how capitalism gets started. It's the slave trade. The reality is that Karl Marx once said that what he called wage slavery, which is an interesting name that they would give for people working in the factories. Wage slavery, he said, in Europe, required as a pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World, talking about the Americas and where we were. So it's important for us to understand how this thing got started, where it came from. Because it's not like Jesus said, there are some white people who need capitalism and to be richer and wealthier than everybody else, let's drop a load of resources on them. No, it didn't happen that way. And George Bush was lying when he said that they hate us because, to quote him, we are good. Didn't happen that way. The fact is that the wealth and resources that came to all of Europe, that created the world economy, the configuration of the world economy that we are confronted with today, was slavery and colonialism. It was brigandage that was responsible for it. And of course, the system can't say that about itself. It can't do that kind of self-criticism. It tells lies. It says that when we came to this land they now call America, that the stupid Indians, and you know who's stupid for even calling them Indians, right? They didn't know the value. They didn't know the value of the land, so we bought Manhattan for $24 in beads and things like that, which is a lie. It's a total, absolute lie. It has to be a lie because there was no concept of private ownership of the land among the indigenous people. They couldn't have sold it to anybody. It's a lie. It's a fantasy. So they can't say we came and murdered, slaughtered everybody and took it. They don't write that in the history books. And that's part of what it is that we're looking at. Comrades, brothers and sisters, you know, a few years ago, the United States spent a lot of resources to send a spacecraft to what they said was the end of the universe, to Jupiter. Anybody remember that? And they didn't say they were looking to make sure they got a corner on all minerals that might be there, or that they was just trying to secure the high ground for some military purposes. They said that the reason they did it was because it was the end of the universe, and that they wanted to find out through going to Jupiter how the entire things got started. And what I'm saying now is the discussion that we're having now is our trip to Jupiter, to understand how this whole thing got started. How is it that children, black children in Cleveland, a black child in Cleveland, can be gunned down, 12 years old, in a playground with a play gun 2 seconds after a cop arrived? How is it that we can live in a country where 1 out of every 8 human beings in prison is an African in this country? How is it can we live in the circumstances that we do, where the value of the amount of wealth owned by the average white family is 22 times greater than the amount of wealth owned by the average African family? And of course, we hear the stories, the fantasies, the stories. It's because we were stupid and we sold Manhattan for $24 an hour. That's the basic kind of line that we hear to explain these cruel realities that's been imposed on the vast majority of the peoples of this earth by Europe, including America, and capitalism. And capitalism was born out of this process of slavery and colonialism. In fact, Europe was born out of this process of slavery and colonialism. In fact, there was no such thing as Europe until the 17th century. And it was before then. People who live in these territories that we now call Europe identified and defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other. The Celts, come on, somebody say it. Goths, the Visigoths, and the Normans, etc. And they were engaged in incessant tribal warfare. The thing that consolidated Europe, that created the white man, if you will, was the slave trade and colonialism. And this created the circumstances, conditions, and the material basis of this group of people who lived in poverty and despair to identify themselves primarily not in relationship to each other, but primarily in relationship to the rest of us. This is what it is that we're looking at. This is how the world got to be the way it was. It is. I mean, you take the fact that in the 4 short years of 1347 to 1352, at least half the white people on the planet Earth died of plague. You can't have a viable economy if half the white people, if half the population is dead in 4 short years. And then even after that 4 short years, you're talking about for the next 100 years or more, that and other plagues visiting this territory that we now call Europe. So how does Europe rescue itself? It rescues itself through slavery and colonialism. When most of the peoples of the world met Europe, Europe lived under feudalism. You know the romanticized period when Robin Hood was running around, they say, robbing the rich and giving to the poor, which was the majority of the people. And feudalism was the next closest thing to slavery. And Europe lived under feudalism for something like 1,000 years. And naked and afraid was what many of them were under feudalism, literally, sometimes without clothing on their backs. This was the reality. How the hell do we move from that place to this place? And you see evidence of it, you know, if you look at the history and hear from some people like Cecil Rhodes, who talk about how he was walking through the working class area of London, and people were talking about bread, and they were involved in talking about making struggle. And he declared that when I saw this, I understood that if England is to survive, we must become imperialist. He said we have to have a place to send the surplus populations, and we also have to have the resources that are out there. Cecil Rhodes, of course, was this guy who went into South Africa, Southern Africa, who was responsible on at least one occasion of killing 5,000 African people in an afternoon with maximum machine guns, after which they had tea. Was one who brought white people to come to England and gave to Southern Africa and actually gave them land if they would participate in killing the African people who occupied that territory. This is the part of the process of primitive accumulation of capital that gave rise to the capitalist system itself, and that helped to define the world that we are living in right now. So this is the part of the struggle that we are involved in. We're having this discussion today, and possibly a discussion that many people have some difficulties coming to grips with. But it is only because the United States succeeded in killing revolutionaries all over the world in the 1960s. We saw the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s. We saw the United States government working with France and Belgium, who in 1960 took Patrice Lumumba, one of the most honorable men on the planet Earth, who dared to challenge Belgium's right to control Congo. And they murdered him. They cut him up in little pieces. They then put him in barrels of acid and then burned the body to try to make sure there was nothing left for anybody to discover or anybody to be able to hold up as an icon for our freedom. They overthrew Kwame Nkrumah in 1966, the Johnson administration. This is pre-Trump. I'm saying this because everybody wants to act like Trump is the contradiction, when Trump is simply a symptom of a greater contradiction. Yeah. And the Johnson administration was responsible for overthrowing Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. And who was it in 1954 that was responsible for the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, simply because, and he was elected by the Iranian people, and he simply wanted to nationalize the Iranian oil, of which they were only getting something like 16% of the value, but the others going to things like British Petroleum and what have you. And they overthrew Mossadegh and put in his stead this criminal entity, this criminal force that they knew as the Shah, Pahlavi, and who brutalized and murdered the people there and created this vicious secret intelligence organization called SAVAK that would actually come to the United States and other places where Iranian students were, and that they dared to protest in this country against what the Shah was doing in Iran. Their families would be killed in Iran. Who was it that overthrew the Arbenz government in 1954 in Guatemala? The U.S. CIA. The CIA that's being so highly extolled by pundits on TV today because Trump is somehow interfering with these noble men and women, etc. This the United States government pre-Trump. And what has happened, of course, especially in the more recent period, it's been something that's been unfolding for a while. Because a parasite and U.S. capitalism in general is a parasite. It was born as a parasite. That's what slavery is. That's what slavery is. A parasite is an entity that lives off a host of another kind of organism. It has to. When you talk about U.S. imperialism, stop being imperialism, it can't stop. When you say the capitalists must stop doing what they're doing, they can't stop because it's a parasite. And if a parasite stops sucking the blood living off the host, it dies. Yeah. It dies. And this is the source of the deep and profound crisis of imperialism that we're looking at today. And you can see the crisis everywhere. It's a deep and profound crisis. You know that a social system is defined by the economic base of that system and the superstructure. And the superstructure born of that economic base is the ideas, the culture, even the political institutions spring from that superstructure. If you got a system that's based on slavery and colonialism, that lives even today of a parasitic relationship with the rest of the world, it will be reflected in the ideas in that society. It's taught in the schools and preached from the pulpits of that society. That's the superstructure. Don't say, well, white people ought to stop being racist. You can't stop what's in your brain. That's the superstructure that teaches us what to think and teaches me what to think about African people too. And what I get taught is not good. That's the superstructure that we're looking at. And so if the struggle that we're involved in is not a struggle against the ideas in white people's heads, I'd have to be a lunatic at this point in my life to be running around worrying about what's in the heads of white people, especially if I got a gun. That's supposed to be a joke. The fact is that the oppressed peoples around the world are not concerned with what white people think about us. We are concerned about what America does to us, what Europe does to us, and what white people participate in allowing America to do to us. That's our concern. We say that racism is the ideological foundation of capitalism. It is the ideological foundation of this colonial reality that we're talking about. It is the thing that unites white people with the grotesque, brutal murder and mayhem that's been visited upon the rest of us. That's the problem. And the way out of this is not saying hands up, don't shoot, and Black Lives Matter, because Black lives do not matter to imperialists. Black power matters. And that's the question that we have to fight for. And in my lifetime, I remember there used to be a saying, when people were doing poorly, they say you don't have a Chinaman's chance. They don't say that anymore. In fact, China got more chances than most of us. But China did not get its chances by telling white people to fall in love with us, by trying to integrate with America. China got its chances by developing its own capacity, developing power, so that it could challenge the power of the imperialists. This is not a pro-Chinese statement, nor is it an anti-Chinese statement in the way that some people may hear what I've just said. My struggle with China really have to do with my recognition of the weakness of the African Revolution here and every place else. China can only do, and China is the fastest growing economy in Africa, it's China. And that's a statement of the weakness, the destruction of the revolutionary organization that was led by the United States and Europe. That's why AFRICOM, the Africa Command System, command was created just to deal with Africa, to contend with China, to contend with any possibility that African revolutionaries would stand up to take back our continent. Africa, the richest continent on the richest territory on the planet Earth, 12 million square miles of nothing but value, riches there. But African people are starving to death in every place in the globe. It's not because Africa is poor. It's because Africa is being looted. Yes. And Africa, to stop Africa from being looted, is not to say we shall overcome. It's to organize African people everywhere on the planet Earth so that we can take back our resources and guarantee ourselves that our children will have a future. That's what this party is about. That's what we set out to make sure would happen. Even with the defeat of the Black Revolution, we set as our mission to complete that revolution. The revolution that they thought was over when they wounded and murdered Che Guevara on October 9th, 1967 in Bolivia. The revolution that they thought they had ended when they killed Fred Hampton in December 1969. When they killed Malcolm X and they killed Martin Luther King. And they killed revolutionary forces around the world. And when I say revolutionary forces, I'm talking about people who were simply fighting for the happiness of our people and the return of the resources that have been stolen from us. That's a just struggle. Yes, and we believe in just struggle. And we don't care who's making a just struggle, we unite with a just struggle. We united with the Sandinistas when they first began the struggle in Nicaragua. We were first in the line with the Sandinistas. We turned over all the resources that we had to them, even though we had never met a Nicaraguan in person before, because they were fighting against imperialism, and white people have to have the ability to also unite with the oppressed in making the struggle to end the kind of world that we live in. Because what has happened is white people find yourselves in a state of isolation from the rest of humanity, protecting stolen loot. So everybody lives behind these bars, in their homes, afraid of going past dark alleys because some African like me is going to be waiting to take something that you got that I should have. We want to end that. And the way white people end this relationship that you have with the rest of us is join on the side of the people who are fighting to destroy white power. It must be defeated. It must be defeated. And I'm going to sit down, but I want to say that all the problems that we see in the world, most people on earth do not have clean drinking water. Most people on earth do not have decent shelter. Most of the people on the planet Earth. This is what we are fighting to change. Many people are mobilized, obviously, because of their immediate interests. My child just got shot, or my relative just went to prison, or I can't find a supermarket in my community, or the other kinds of things that happen. But ultimately, the struggle is to overturn this kind of social system, so that human beings can have the ability to live with each other without fear, without anybody exploiting and living at the expense of anybody else. In order to do that, we're going to have to drive a dagger into the heart of white power, destroy, wipe it off the face of the planet Earth. That's the only way. Don't be upset about that. Look at what we see in the world. If there is an oppressed woman on the planet Earth, white power does that, not black power. If there's an oppressed homosexual, white power does that, not black power. if the workers are exploited, white power is doing that, not black power. Black power wants to liberate us all. And you have to have the ability to unite with that. Otherwise, you'll be stuck in the same situation of simply fighting for white rights in the name of socialism or something else like that. The whole rotten thing rests upon the pedestal of slavery and colonialism. And the biggest problem that we've had with the revolutionary movement in the world for the last 100 or more years is white people who will not abandon this relationship and this identity to unite with the rest of us. That's been the blocking thing. That's been the thing that stood in between us being able to immediately get rid of this misery that we're confronted with and the length of time that it's taken. Because we're going to win. The oppressed are going to win. You see that happening every day. You see the world is changing every day. You see that nothing is like it used to be. Just over the last few years, you've seen it. You've seen that the oppressor cannot go and kill people and behead them in northern Africa and then go and be in the safety of sidewalk cafes in Paris anymore. It doesn't work that way. The oppressed are taking the battle to the very homes and bedrooms of the oppressors. Those days are over when you can think that there's some inviolable sanctity to security in Europe or in North America. Those days are over. And you should be happy. And you should help to end those days. So I want to say those things. I am the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party. We are a revolutionary organization. We understand that this discussion is worthless if it doesn't mean that we're going to do something to change it. We have a political party. We're a political party because we think that the highest expression of the will of the people to fight is a political party. Parties do exist. You have parties in this country, the Democratic and Republican parties, as you know, and parties represent class interests, as quiet as it's kept. There's no party that does not represent class interests. And even though the Republicans and the Democrats will let you join them, they do not represent you. You complain about that all the time. I hear you complain about it. That's why you're complaining, voting for the lesser of two evils. Neither represents you. They represent the ruling class. They represent the one that created these contradictions. And the elections in this system are simply non-violent contests between sectors of the ruling class for control of the state to their own profit-making advantage. That's all an election is. And as quiet as it's kept, you will not find elections in the Bible. And I'm saying this because people treat it like that's what it is. So our party represents the African working class. We do not represent the Jesse Jacksons of the world. And this is not to say that Jesse might not be a good guy. We do not represent the Al Sharptons of the world. And Al too may be wonderful. And nor do we represent the what's his name? What's the guy who was president just a little while ago? The Obamas, right? Anything like that. We represent the most despised, oppressed sector of the African population. The ones who challenge and say that the reason you're failing because you're sagging. The ones who are in a permanent state of resistance, which is why they sag. White man say, wear your pants this way, I'm going to wear my pants this way. Wear your hat this way, I'm going to wear my hat this way. Wear my clothes, I'm going to wear my clothes this way. In a permanent state of resistance, our responsibility is to give direction and ideology and organization to that resistance so that we can go ahead and make this revolution and end this stuff that's happening to all of us. I thank you so much for your patience and Uhuru.